Alan Greenspan died Monday at 100. The same week, Kevin Warsh put out a 130-word Fed statement, the shortest since Greenspan's own 128-word statement in January 2002. Same news cycle. Almost nobody connected the two.
And that collision is exactly what this episode is about. Welcome to the Trade Room.
I'm August. And I'm Blake. What you got from the obituaries was the maestro, 4 presidents, the great moderation, the long boom. What you mostly didn't get was the part where opacity was the policy, deliberately.
Right, and then Bernanke spent 20 years building the exact opposite framework, forward guidance, dot plots, the whole apparatus, and Warsh just walked in and shrank the statement back down to Greenspan-era length on day one.
To the crowd, some traders just saw the old guard. Some saw the beginning of a fundamental shift away from transparency and forward guidance and back to a system where mystery is intentional statecraft.
And the market had thoughts. S&P down 1.21%, Nasdaq down 1.34%, 2-year yield's biggest single-day Fed jump since 2008.
So today, we pressure test all of it. The Greenspan opacity era, what it actually cost in 1994 when traders had no framework, how Bernanke's forward guidance got born as an emergency tool and maybe never left, and what Warsh's June 17th move forces markets to answer next.
We close with Reprice It, accountability round, what broke in each regime, who should have seen it, and the specific date that tests whether Warsh's no guidance bet holds.
Walk me through the math on that. That's the question we keep coming back to today. Let's start with what the obituaries missed. 130 words.
That's it?
That's the entire Fed policy statement Warsh issued on June 17th. 130 words. Powell's April statement, 341. CNBC ran the numbers.
So Warsh basically said, hold rates, price stability, see you later?
And the market did not take that quietly.
Wow.
2-year Treasury yields jumped 16 basis points the same afternoon. CNN had that number right after the close.
16 basis points in a single session because what, the Fed stopped explaining itself?
More or less. No forward guidance, no projected rate path. Warsh didn't even submit a dot plot forecast for himself. One missing dot.
And all of that is its own story, but the timing gets strange here.
Greenspan.
NPR reported it Monday, died the same week, age 100. The man who essentially invented the style of Fed communication, cryptic, sparse, gave the market almost nothing, dies the same week his philosophy walks back through the front door.
The Federal Reserve put out a statement calling him the 13th chairman, 18 years, 4 presidents, and the tributes all used the word maestro.
Because that was the brand, inscrutable by design.
Right, and Bloomberg noted the tributes poured in from former colleagues who had a front-row seat, but also acknowledged his ultimate legacy is clouded by 2008.
So you've got one era ending literally and a new one starting in the same news cycle. Most people read those as 2 completely separate stories.
Were they, though?
That's what I keep coming back to. Fisher Investments flagged that Warsh's 130-word statement is the lowest count since Greenspan's 128 words in January 2002.
2 words apart, 24 years later. What does it mean when the signal is almost identical, but the world around it is completely different?
That's the question the tributes didn't ask.
So the tributes came in fast. Bloomberg noted they poured in from former colleagues and market players. The maestro framing, 4 presidents, 18.5 years, Black Monday, the Great Moderation, that's the version.
And it's not wrong. The Fed's own statement called it a lasting mark on this institution. The Federal Reserve doesn't issue those lightly.
Right, but walk through the obit cycle for a second. What did most of the coverage actually lead with?
Great moderation, irrational exuberance, the 2008 asterisk, in that order, every time.
So it's the celebratory arc with a caveat bolted on at the end. And what's almost entirely missing?
1994.
1994. The Richmond Fed documented this. The Dow dropped almost 2.5% on the February 4th announcement alone. Not over a week, one announcement.
And the bond market reaction was worse. 30-year Treasury yields went from roughly 6% at the start of that year to near 7.75% by September. The Richmond Fed put the total bond market loss at $600 billion.
$600 billion in a single tightening cycle.
Orange County went bankrupt. That's not a footnote. That's a California county declaring bankruptcy directly connected to the rate shock.
So why does 1994 barely show up in the tributes?
Because he got the soft landing. GDP had 4% that year. Unemployment kept falling. The economy validated him, so the method got a pass.
The outcome laundered the process. That's worth pressure testing.
And there's no communication framework to even evaluate. Markets had to infer the move from open market operations. There was no statement until February 4th, 1994. That was the first one ever.
The first Fed statement in history also happens to be the one that dropped the Dow 2.5%. That's a data point.
Yeah, the debut did not go smoothly.
Now, what makes this week strange? The Greenspan death and the Warsh press conference both ran in the same news cycle. Most outlets covered them as completely separate stories.
Completely separate. Greenspan in the obituary section, Warsh in the markets section. Nobody really connected the thread.
And that thread, the question of what the Fed owes markets in terms of communication, that's exactly what we need to get into. Because the 1994 hike wasn't an accident, it was a choice about how much opacity a central bank can operate with.
And Greenspan had a specific answer to that question. We should probably examine it.
So before 1994, walk me through the actual mechanics. No statement, no press conference. How did traders know when the Fed moved?
Right. You watch open market operations the morning after. The New York Fed desk would drain reserves or add them, and the rate moved.
That was your signal.
And the lag?
Day of, if you were fast. But you were inferring, not reading. There's no announcement. You're watching a plumbing operation and translating it into policy.
Which is insane when you think about what's at stake.
February 4th, 1994 changes that. The Fed releases its first ever written statement. Greenspan himself signed off on it, and markets still blew up. Dow dropped 2.5%. Bond market cratered.
So even with a statement, the shock was real.
Because no one had priced it. The statement existed, but the communication framework didn't. The Fed hadn't built expectations before the meeting. They just announced on the day.
First statement in history, and it still caused a crisis. That's a rough debut.
The Federal Reserve noted Greenspan decided to announce immediately, and I'm quoting here, to avoid any misunderstanding of the committee's purposes, which is rich. The misunderstanding happened anyway.
Because the signal wasn't the statement. The signal was everything you'd said and done in the weeks before, and they'd said nothing.
Exactly. And that's the mechanics of opacity. Ambiguity wasn't an accident, it was the operating model. Greenspan himself basically said later, you don't want to surprise the markets unless there's a purpose to it, which means surprise is sometimes the purpose.
Okay, but then 1996 is the perfect example of what that looks like sideways.
December 5th, black tie dinner at the American Enterprise Institute. Greenspan asks, mid-speech, I'm not exaggerating, a rhetorical question about whether irrational exuberance has unduly escalated asset values.
One subordinate clause.
One subordinate clause, buried in a dense speech. The Tokyo market was open. Nikkei dropped 3% before the U.S. Open. The Dow fell 2.3% the next morning.
Global markets moved on a question he didn't answer.
And he later wrote he was choosing his words carefully, hedging in his usual Fed speak. But the audience got the message anyway, because when you've spent years saying nothing clearly, anything that sounds like something lands like a detonation.
That's the failure mode of strategic opacity. You train markets to overread every syllable.
And then you can't control what they hear.
So the 1994 shock forces a rethink. If your first ever statement still cratered the bond market, the problem isn't the statement. It's that you need a whole architecture around it. Communication before the decision, not just at the moment of it.
Which is exactly the problem Bernanke inherits, and the solution he builds is a different animal entirely. So Bernanke didn't invent forward guidance as a philosophy. He invented it as emergency equipment. Rates hit zero in 2008, no conventional tools left, and you need markets to price in your intent when you can't move the lever anymore.
Right, and Bankrate reported it well. The dot plot launched in January 2012 explicitly to guide investors on the policy path during post-crisis ultra-low rate conditions. Oxford Economics described it as aggressive forward guidance.
Walk me through the assumption, though. The assumption baked in is the crisis conditions that justify the tool persist indefinitely.
Which they clearly didn't.
Rates went back up, the zero lower bound went away, and yet dot plot's still running, 12 years.
Bernanke built scaffolding and everyone decided the scaffolding was load-bearing.
That's actually the right image, and Warsh was inside the building when it went up. He served as a governor from 2006 to 2011. He watched Bernanke design this architecture.
And he's been skeptical of it ever since. That's the thing that gets me. I've been skeptical of it ever since. I argued it as a sitting governor. I'm not discovering a problem. I'm finally in a position to do something about it.
So the question I keep coming back to, was Bernanke really solving a problem?
Oh, absolutely. No question. Rates at zero, markets need an anchor, you have to communicate something.
I buy that. The 2008 case is airtight. My issue is what happens when an emergency tool becomes standard operation. What assumption keeps it running after the emergency is over?
Market dependency. Once you've anchored borrowing costs to Fed projections, you've changed how pricing works. Stripping that out isn't neutral.
George Perkis at Bespoke Investment Group put a number on it. He said forward guidance suppressed volatility and kept borrowing rates lower, and pulling it now could add roughly a quarter point to mortgage rates.
A quarter point. Not catastrophic, but that's real money for anyone refinancing right now.
And his read is that Warsh's move may actually push more attention to the other 18 members of the rate-setting committee. Their speeches get louder when the chair goes quiet.
Which is either brilliant decentralization or a coordination nightmare. Depends on the day.
Depends on the data print, and that's where Warsh's bet either pays off or blows up. He's taken the training wheels off in an environment where inflation isn't dead and rates aren't near zero. The justification Bernanke had in 2012 doesn't exist right now.
So did the tool outlast its justification?
Warsh clearly thinks so. Markets got their answer on June 17th, and those numbers are something else entirely. So Bespoke flagged something striking. June 17th was the worst opening day for a new Fed chair since 1994. Full circle.
Of course it was.
CNBC had the closing numbers. S&P down 1.21%, Nasdaq down 1.34%, and Dow off 507 points. And the two-year yield jumped 16 basis points to 4.216%, the biggest Fed day move in that tenor since March 2008.
That is not a neutral read on a hold. That's a repricing.
Right, and the thing that made it weirder, Warsh didn't submit a dot. First sitting chair to abstain. 9 of the other 18 officials projected a hike by year-end. He just watched from the sidelines.
Which is either principled or deeply strange depending on what he does next, because now markets have no anchor, no chair dot, no forward guidance.
Walk me through the curve, because that's where the tension lives. Short end screaming hikes, 2-year at 4.21. Long end, 30-year actually fell that day.
Yeah, short end pricing hikes, long end pricing slower growth, or policy error. Both can't be right simultaneously.
So which is it?
That's what every CPI print decides now. Without guidance, every data release is a full policy repricing event. The volatility surface changed June 17th, not just the statement.
Evercore's Krishna Guha put it well. Warsh views market volatility as a price worth paying to get markets pricing data independently, not Fed signals.
Maybe, but ING's rates team noted the same week that traders went from expecting cuts to pricing a hike as early as October.
Wow.
That's a lot of volatility to absorb on principle.
And here's what I keep coming back to. The VIX jumped 12% on June 17th alone. That's not the market calmly processing new information.
No, that's the market asking, what's the model now? And nobody handed them one.
Which sets up the exact question we need to answer before we close this thing out. Who should have seen this coming, and who actually did?
Yeah, and the tributes to Greenspan last week didn't touch it.
So what's the actual accountability here? Every regime had a real failure mode. Greenspan's opacity gave us 1994 in a dinner speech that moved global markets. Bernanke's transparency handed us the taper tantrum and a Fed that got locked into its own signals straight through 2021.
And Warsh just removed the map entirely. The tributes this week were a real opportunity. Here's the man who built opacity, dying the same week his philosophy came back. Most of the coverage just didn't go there.
The obit cycle never asked the harder question.
Which is, does less guidance fix the problem, or does it just change which problem you have? Without forward guidance, every CPI print becomes a full policy vote in the market.
And the July 14 CPI, the first major inflation print between now and the July 28 FOMC meeting, that's the first real test. If the market reprices hard on that number alone, Warsh's bet starts looking expensive.
The two-year yield already moved more on June 17th than on almost any Fed day in recent memory. One data print without a policy map. That tells you whether the volatility is manageable or structural.
What does the market do if a single CPI print misses by 0.3? No guidance, no dot plot, no signal.
Exactly. That's the question Warsh is betting we can handle. July 14th is when we find out.
All right, that's the episode.
Greenspan dies at 100, Warsh drops a 130-word statement the same week, and almost no one in the coverage connected those two things.
That's the whole thread right there. The man who built Fed opacity exits the same week his philosophy walks back in through the front door.
And the market answered immediately. The two-year yield moved 16 basis points on the day.
No guidance, no map, just the data.
Which brings us back to July 14th, first major CPI print before the next FOMC. That's the real test for Warsh's bet.
Watch that number closely.
If you got something out of this one, send it to somebody who read the obits and stop there.
New episode drops every Tuesday. Subscribe wherever you listen. And August, good conversation today.
Yeah, one for the list.